Let's get started by looking back at the just concluded COP26 as we get into our conversations on Caricom. And for that, we're obviously joined by Barbados Ambassador to Caricom, His Excellency David Comissiong. Good morning to you, Mr. Comissiong.
Good morning, Pearson. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much as usual. Now, listen, over time they came up with what some consider to be a whimper of a deal, which did not necessarily agree to the 1.5% emissions. But it's a deal nonetheless. So what's in that agreement now for Barbados, and what can Barbados do?
Yes, so we now have the Glasgow Climate Pact. Yes, some disappointment, but also a number of encouraging signs. And I wish to make the case here this morning that you can see the hands and influence of Caricom in general, and of Barbados and Prime Minister Mayor Mottley in particular, all over those encouraging signs. You know, back on when we celebrated 26th of July this year, I made the point that one of the reasons for Barbados becoming a republic, moving away from the Queen of England as our head of state, and substituting our own native head of state, is because more and more we are being called upon to play a very important international leadership role on behalf of developing countries, former colonies, and therefore it would look wrong. Barbados is on the international stage representing former colonies and still having, you know, the head of state of our former colonial master as our head. So anyhow, but the point is, if you look at this Glasgow Climate Pact, okay, you made the point, Pearson, that they did not get to the pledges to cut emissions that would deliver 1.5 degrees, that would deliver a climate increase of no more than 1.5 degrees by the end of this century. They did, however, get to 1.8. And they have agreed that by COP27 next year in Egypt, that usually they come with these nationally determined contributions or pledges every 5 years. But they have agreed now that they will come back next year at COP27 in Egypt to further reduce their pledges so as to bring us in line with 1.5. That there's the hand, the influence of Caricom and Prime Minister Mottley all over that. You know, people need to be aware that Prime Minister Mottley didn't suddenly appear by chance on that opening ceremony. She was specially selected of all the leaders in the world. She was especially selected by the UN and by the organizers of that conference to be placed in that pivotal, that critical spot in the opening ceremony to get the attention of the world. And that is what she did with great excellence and impact. Secondly, adaptation finance. We didn't get the 100 billion per year at this Glasgow conference, but we got a couple of things. One, we got the increase in the percentage of climate finance to go towards adaptation to move up from 25% to 40%. We were asking 50. They came in at 40. Also, we got the agreement that we will achieve the 100 billion per annum by 2023. And we also got a commitment that the developed countries will double their contributions to climate finance from 2025. So, not perfection, but progress. And you can see this was a key goal for Caricom and for Barbados. Compensation for loss and damage. For the first time in one of these conferences of the parties, we got the acknowledgement that countries like the Caribbean countries that suffer catastrophic climate-related events like hurricanes, that a loss and damage mechanism to provide them with financial compensation will be set up, and the details of that mechanism will be worked out at COP27 in Egypt next year. That's number 3. Number 4, the idea of using IMF special drawing rights to beef up climate finance. That idea was proposed by Prime Minister Mottley in her opening address, drawing upon the work of Professor Avinash Prasad, her advisor on economic matters. And that has been taken on board, not in the expansive way that PM Mottley and Professor Prasad had proposed. They proposed something much more substantial than what the parties were willing to agree upon. But nevertheless, that breakthrough concept that we can use these special drawing rights, these assets that the IMF can create and can be put into a trust fund, and then can be used to generate actual currency from the major countries of the world to go towards financing projects that will reduce greenhouse emissions. That has been taken on board. And finally, the Glasgow Pact encourages the international financial institutions to use climate vulnerability as a measure to determine whether countries like Barbados and the Caricom countries like Antigua and Bahamas and so forth, so-called middle income countries, to use climate vulnerability to determine whether these countries should have access to concession and grant financing. Remember, right now we don't have access to that financing because they use this GDP per capita and say, well, you are middle income countries, you don't need it. So they have finally come to the recognition that even though we may be so-called middle income countries, that we face the climate crisis and we are vulnerable to things like hurricanes and rising sea waters and all the rest of it. So I would say those 5 very important positive developments, the hand of Caricom, Barbados, Prime Minister Mottley, all over them.
So we know from past experience, agreements have been made, agreements have not been kept. So how does Caricom leverage who we are, and especially as Prime Minister Mottley, as you said, is quite pivotal in everything that we've seen come out of this agreement? How can we keep our hands on it so that they do live up to what they have agreed?
Well, one of the important things they did at this COP was to complete the rule book that since the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, that point that you have raised, that yes, you can make these pledges, but what is the mechanism or the framework for accountability for the UN to keep track, to make sure that countries are actually implementing the pledges? And up to now, that mechanism of rules and regulations had not been in place. So that was finally completed at this COP. So we will now see how it works and if it works well. But there seems to be a new commitment. In the past, the idea was you give countries like 5 years before you review them and all the rest of that. Now there seems to be a greater commitment to keeping an eye on everybody, basically calling for accountability on a year-by-year basis. So the rule book is now in place. By COP27 next year in Egypt, it would have been working for 1 year, and I guess by then we would be able to see how it is going.
And I have to look at all sides. The cynic in some of us that would say, oh boy, Barbados is now in the spotlight, look out, something coming. What do you say to that individual to assure them that the efforts of our Prime Minister, the efforts that we are advancing at those regional and international bodies are bearing fruit and will bear fruit for the future?
Well, the first thing I want to bring to the attention of Barbadians is that, look, I've heard some people, oh, our prime ministers just parading on the international stage, seemingly not understanding the very serious policy strategy behind all that Barbados and Prime Minister Mottley in particular is doing in these international initiatives. The reality is, um, countries like Barbados and the Caricom countries, we have really done, coming from where we have come from, our history of colonial domination, of centuries of enslavement, of other countries, Britain in particular, looting and siphoning off our resources for centuries, the fruits of the labor of our people for centuries. We have really done a remarkable job building our nations with our own efforts. But the truth is, as remarkable a job as we have done, we can see clear signs that, look, we do need greater access to international resources, including international financial resources, including a more sympathetic understanding of our situation by the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, etc., to understand that we need more policy space to be able to protect ourselves, to develop our economies. And incidentally, that is actually the reparations message too. That is embedded in the reparations message, that there must be a reparative restructuring of this international economic and political order to make more space, more resources available to former colonized and enslaved countries and peoples who have had just to do monumental, almost miraculous efforts of development on their own. And so the recognition is now that, look, much is owed to us, and we must make an effort to get these resources. And so if you look at Barbados hosting UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the
Yes.
major UN agency dealing with issues of trade, finance, finance for development, and Barbados taking over the presidency of UNCTAD for 3 years, it is because we are pursuing that agenda. If you look at Prime Minister Mottley taking up the position of chair of the IMF and World Bank Joint Development Committee, and incidentally, her stint as chair ended just last month. Again, it was about getting in that pivotal position to persuade the IMF and the World Bank to make more resources, financial resources available to countries like Barbados and the CARICOM countries and small island developing states, and to give their governments more policy space to be able, to protect their citizens and develop their economies, to have an understanding of the predicament that we face with the COVID pandemic, the collapse of our tourism industries, all the additional expenses we had to spend on healthcare and building Harrison's isolation facility and the
Right.
vaccination costs, to be more sympathetic and understanding. And so that is our mission. That's our mission, is really to revamp the international institutions and how they think and how they behave towards countries like Barbados. So that's what it's about. It's not about just getting on the international stage for the sake of getting
Right.
on the international stage. But having said that, Pearson, bear in mind, climate change is an existential crisis for mankind. This COP might well have been the single most important conference in the history of humankind, bearing in mind what is at stake, the future of our planet.
Right.
And our prime minister was selected to deliver the key message at that conference in the hope that she would gain the attention of the world and wake up the world to this great crisis.
And
by
that she
all
did.
accounts, She did.
She did. Ambassador, we have to leave it right there. Clearly, you know, what I love about these sessions is you give us a chance to better understand the workings and the goings on in these high-level areas, but also in very simple things that navigate our lives in the Caribbean as well, as usual. And so I'm looking forward to next week's engagement with you. Thank you so much for joining us again this morning.